happened near here, and mill owners, by their energy and innovation, made textile production Britain's most important industry. However, for most working people, life was hard. Families of 10 or more lived in tiny, unhealthy houses with no toilet facilities. They no longer worked together as a family, but were split up to serve the needs of the mills. Women here, unlike those in most parts of the country, also worked in the factories. Working people in general had no power. They couldn't vote, and by the 1820s, the factories and mechanization were taking more and more jobs from those still working at home. Working people began to protest. Wages were generally low, and the whole country went through bad as well as good times. The local pioneering spirit, which had seen the growth of mills and factories, was also present in the ways that local people struggled to change their own lives for the better.
At the beginning of the 19th century, the working classes did not have the vote. The country was largely governed by a landed aristocracy. Masters tended to exploit their workers. This is Cronkeyshaw Common, to the north of the town centre. It was to open spaces like this that the local people came, not only for their leisure meetings, but for their political meetings also. A very young John Bright has left us an account of one of these meetings, and so has Samuel Bamford, the Middleton radicalist. He became famous later on for his description of the events popularly known as Peterloo. Estimates of the numbers of people attending Peterloo vary from 60,000 to 100,000 or more. The magistrates became rather alarmed at this number, and one of them, the Reverend Hay, gave the order to the military to charge the crowd.
And then, slackening rein and striking spur into their steeds, they dashed forward and began cutting the people. "Stand fast," I said. "They're riding upon us, stand fast." The cavalry were in confusion. They evidently could not, with all the weight of man and horse, penetrate that compact mass of human beings, and their sabres were plied to hew a way through naked, held-up hands and defenceless heads. And then chopped limbs and wound-gaping skulls were seen, and groans and cries were mingled with the din of that horrid confusion.
Minutes later, 11 were dead and 400 were wounded. The Reverend Hay became well known for his actions on this day and was subsequently appointed Vicar of Rochdale.
So Rochdale had an integral part to play in the protest of Peterloo, and under the leadership of Thomas Livesey, it led the national protest against the new Poor Law.
Behind me is the tower of Birchill Hospital, formerly Durnley Workhouse. It symbolises a struggle that took place here in Rochdale, a struggle in which local people defied the government for over 40 years. In 1834, the government passed a law that changed the way that the unemployed, the elderly and the sick were looked after in times of need. Small workhouses, giving poor people a roof over their heads, were to be swept away and replaced by places like these, called bastilles by local people, after the famous French prison, where life was to be so terrible that no one would ever go in there by choice. Rochdale people hated the Act. Local workhouses, such as the one at Spotland, were humane places where, despite the behaviour and the problems caused by some of the inmates, people were treated with kindness by the workhouse masters and mistresses.
21st of December 1836. We gave old Diggle leave to go to Bury to see his friends on Monday morning. He went off, and he'd not been gone long when John Holt missed a good new waistcoat. So a search was immediately made, and it could not be found. So we sent a man after Diggle, and he found it concealed in his breast. Old Diggle has also been taking improper liberties with Mary Grinrod, but she is not in her right mind, being only 25 years of age. Last Monday evening we had a man from London, either the overseer or the governor of St Giles Workhouse. He was very particular in his enquiries about their meat, if they had it weighed to them. We told him no, they had as much set as they could eat, and if they wanted more they had it.
A far cry from Oliver Twist. Thousands of local people protested against the destruction of these old workhouses, with Rochdale leading the national protest against the Act. And it wasn't until 1877, 43 years after the Act was passed, and when the system itself was at least a little bit more humane, that Dearnley Workhouse finally opened.
As working conditions worsened, wages for hand-loom weavers were reduced, and people formed themselves into the early textile trade unions.
This is Site Common, one of the great gathering grounds of the 18th and early 19th centuries. This is where the people of Rochdale met to discuss their grievances and form associations like trade unions. Now, I've been associated with trade unionism all my life, and one thing that I'm proud of is the association that Rochdale has with the beginnings of that movement. As far back as 1818, for example, when trade unions, by the way, were still illegal, the Rochdale Flannel Weavers Association was founded. And because they were illegal, they were a very secretive organisation. Equally so, because of their secretive nature, they had very unusual ceremonies. For example, the death ceremony, where a member would pledge allegiance to the organisation, quite literally, at pain of death. And the famous twisting in ceremony, which was adopted by the Tolpuddle martyrs in 1834. The martyrs would use it as part of their ceremony. Clearly we know their fate. They were imprisoned and then they were sent off to Australia and became heroes of the trade unionist movement.
Although not all owners were bad employers, generally what they wanted was more power for themselves and respect from their workforce. The Rochdale area became the centre of a movement called the Anti-Corn Law League. The Corn Laws were part of a system that protected farmers and landowners and worked against industry by limiting exports. They also kept the price of bread high.
And which since 70 or 80 years ago was first imported into Lancashire. That is
In the early 1840s, middle-class businessmen such as Rochdale's John Bright led a successful national campaign to get rid of these laws and promoted free trade with other countries.
Lancashire, then, is the child of trade and industry in their most remarkable and magnificent forms. That trade was not long ago an infant, struggling into life. It is now great and powerful, and in no longer period than suffices for the child to become a man. It has sprung up into a giant of enormous proportions. And yet that giant, powerful as it is, lies well nigh prostrate under the fetters and shackles which a benighted, ignorant, and thoughtless polity has formed around its muscular form.
The League and other activists were known as the Manchester School, although with John Bright's contribution and the work of Richard Cobden, later MP for Rochdale, Rochdale's influence was enormous. In later life, he reminisced about it, whilst unveiling a statue of his friend in Bradford.
Speaking to me about it more than once, he said, "When people are themselves in a state of frenzy, so that their reason seems to be dethroned, it is useless to argue with them. We must wait till there comes a cooler and more reasonable time."
Many enterprising businessmen concentrated upon increasing their overseas trade. Thomas Robinson's machine manufacturers of Rochdale, for instance, anticipated our present global economy by establishing factories throughout the world. Others travelled the world themselves. Members of the Heap family, woolen manufacturers of Rochdale, not only compiled an amazing photographic record of their 1870s tour, but also acquired an important collection of Egyptology. In 1832, many of the new, wealthier middle class had finally obtained the right to vote. As the local economy worsened, working people demanded that they too should be represented in Parliament. Thousands supported the Chartist movement.
Its main demand was for adult male suffrage, that is the vote for all men over the age of 21, with the expectation that when passed by Parliament, women would soon afterwards receive the vote as well.
In the Rochdale area, thousands of Lancashire and Yorkshire people attended meetings at the base